All right, hello everyone. I am Suzanne Lennon, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Women and Gender Studies. Along with my colleague, Dr. Christine Alexander, I am also one of the co-hosts of this year's virtual Women Scholar Speaker Series. The Women Scholar Speaker Series was founded 20 years ago as a response to the fact that the U of L was neither an inclusive nor an equitable place to work. While some things have changed in the 2 decades since then, I think that those descriptors actually still apply to this place. There remains much work to be done, especially when it comes to naming and challenging the structural conditions that shape and often limit the lives of the people who make up the University of Lethbridge. The 2022-23 speaker series is focused on exactly this, and therefore it is a real honor to host today's roundtable event, which aims to recognize and celebrate the activist and intellectual legacies of our late colleague, Dr. Gülden Özcan. I want to acknowledge the University of Lethbridge's Office of the President for its ongoing financial support of the Women Scholar Speaker Series, while also thanking Hannah Fantin and Jenny Oseen for their invaluable practical assistance. I recognize that some of you may be signing in from elsewhere, and as this is a University of Lethbridge event, I want to begin with its land acknowledgement. The University of Lethbridge's Blackfoot name is Iniskim, meaning sacred buffalo stone. The University of Lethbridge acknowledges and deeply appreciates the Siksikaitsitapi people's connection to their traditional territory. We, as people living and benefiting from Blackfoot Confederacy traditional territory, honor the traditions of people who have cared for this land since time immemorial. We recognize the diverse population of Indigenous peoples who attend the U of L and their contributions to shaping and strengthening the university community in the past, present, and future. Expressing such gratitude must also include acknowledging how the actual practices of caretaking and stewardship are often unable to take place to their full extent under occupation and where land has been overlaid with private property. And universities themselves and Western knowledge production are complicit in this. And finally, before turning things over to my colleague, Dr. Athena Ellafrost from the Department of Sociology, I also just want to let you know about our next event, which will be held in early 2023. It will feature Dr. Jennifer Doyle, who is a professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, and the author of the book, Campus Sex, Campus Security, and she will be speaking about the institutional regulation of sexual violence policies in the 21st century university. Athena.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Dr. Gülden Özcan was a brilliant scholar, activist, colleague, friend, loving partner, and mother. She is survived by her partner, Özgür, and their son, Kim. She worked as an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Lethbridge prior to her untimely passing in May of 2022. She would have turned 39 years old on November 26th of this year. I had the honor of working with and being friends with Gülden for just under 4 years. During her short but brilliant career, she accomplished many things. Gülden completed her BA at Başkent University in Turkey and her MA and PhD at Carleton University in Canada. She was an engaged intellectual whose academic work spans the fields of critical criminology, social theory, feminism, and social justice, just to name a few. She was a prolific and well-published scholar. She was also an active member of the Equity Subcommittee of the Canadian Sociological Association. Here at the University of Lethbridge, she was a founding member of SNAC Plus, the support network for academics of color plus, and she was also the first ever recipient of the SNAC Plus Excellence in Equity Award. She was also a member of the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association's Gender, Equity, and Diversity Committee. Her international and internationalist work was reflected in her active involvement with Scholars at Risk. And through Gülden's advocacy, the University of Lethbridge became a member. However, Gülden was so much more than her accomplishments and accolades. She was fierce and funny, and she was one of the kindest people I ever had the honor of becoming friends with. On March 4th, 2022, sociologist and New York Times columnist Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom noted on Twitter that, quote, "The institution cannot love you," end quote. This is especially true for outsiders in the academy, for racialized people, women, queer and trans people, first-generation scholars, working-class people, disabled folks, neurodivergent people, and for those who experience linguistic racism and xenophobia. Please note that these are not mutually exclusive categories. For these people, universities are elitist, exclusionary, and indeed toxic spaces. This is not metaphorical. Racialized women in particular experience higher levels of microaggressions, burnout, and allostatic load, which is the cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events. Racialized women become sicker and die sooner than their white counterparts in the academy. I'll end my intro with a poem by Audre Lorde, who referred to herself as, quote, Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet, end quote, and who was also disabled, a writer, feminist, professor, and civil rights activist. And then I'll provide a quote from Gülden. First, from Audre Lorde, who died of breast cancer at the age of 58 on November 17, 1992. Here is her poem entitled, A Litany for Survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward at once before and after. Seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, this heavy-footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instance and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Thank you, Gülden, for always speaking and for always advocating for social justice. As Gülden said, quote, I believe in the potentials of connection and solidarity to turn impossible to possible in miraculous ways. In fact, I consider my whole existence as an example of it. Thank you all for joining us today. Please excuse my tears. As a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and there will be a Q&A period following the talks this afternoon. If you would like to ask questions, please enter your questions in the Q&A function. You'll find it at the bottom of your screen. So we're very lucky today to have 4 speakers, and our first speaker is Khadija Baker. Khadija Baker is a Montreal-based multidisciplinary artist of Kurdish-Syrian descent. Baker immigrated to Canada from Syria in 2001 She completed her MFA studies at Concordia University in 2012. She is a core member of the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling at Concordia University. Her installations investigate social and political themes centered on the uncertainty of home as it relates to persecution, identity, displacement, and memory. As a witness to traumatic events, unsettled feelings of home are part of her experience. Her multidisciplinary installations often combine textiles, sculpture, performance, sound, and video, and involve participative storytelling and performance to create active spaces for greater understanding. Baker continues her research creation at the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture at Concordia University. Thank you so much, Khadija.
Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to talk for Gülden. The first time I met Gülden Özcan with her partner Özgur, who was guarding his teapot, it was, I remember very well, she mentioned to respect his ceremony if we wanted to drink his tea. And this was during Voices in Dialogue event with community gathering. The beautiful, full of energy Gülden was really remarkable. We become friends later, as we met again around creative work before leaving Ottawa for teaching position. I know how moving was not easy for her leaving the community she worked for and with, and finally she was able to do it. Then when she was at Lethbridge University, she invited me to present a research creation, Birds Crossing Borders, that was around refugees. It was engaging storytelling of Syrian to create deeper understanding around the newly arrived one. Here we met around the social justice. This woman did not set limit for her dreams. She kept searching for ways and side doors to engage and apply her values, beliefs, not only through a class space within an institution, but also be at the heart of communities. When I was a child back home, I knew that on the other side of the artificial borders, so many dreamers worked really hard to achieve similar dream around justice, to end the racism, oppression we survived. Our resistance and its process were shaped in so many ways. I can easily relate to hers. We always looked for spaces to own our intellectual freedom, to own our languages, our language and culture, besides our basic human rights. But I never imagined her journey will be so short. I never imagined her stopping the fight. She never did, I believe so. Her dream when she was a child to be a writer within impossible condition was the forest to push her to cross borders, as to create art has pushed me. It was important for us to add meaning to our world, to exist within the universal one, to stand up for the marginalized and undo the colonial. Keep an eye on our friends and families back home, be there for them, be the connection, and be the space creator for voices that usually are not heard. We always saw her smile, as I do. This smile of courage is our feed for coming days and will be for us a contribution for her journey, to serve value we share and to be there for each other, conserving our differences and respect it. See it as a way to gain a new insight and a new understanding. See it as a way to inspire other ways to exist as we can by being ourselves. Gülden, as I have known, was a fighter. I looked at with pride of being able to stand up. Gülden and so many other women do the fighting, not by carrying weapons, as other Kurdish women do now in our region to reserve families' life, but through her work to change and offering other form of knowledge that has impact on the intellectual and contribute to it, to undo the historical way of performing power while still at the center of the community. Today, where I stand and talk, I put myself in her position to be Gülden. I am certain she would be advocating for justice and communities issue around practices of social justice. And of course, I wanted to lead the issue of my own experience in the academia life and share meaning around inclusion within the university. Before I read this, I really wanted to mention that when I say I, me, it's not about me, it's about the community, my community, because my own experience was never personal. It was because whom I belonged to. So most of the time here and back home, I feel in others, and especially in an institution, a desire to put me in categories, usually under a general label of the marginalized. That has never responded to my actual needs. In Syria, such a technique served to exclude me as a Kurd and to deprive me from my basic rights. Here it is a way for an institution to gain political power and reinforce an image of social progressivenessism. And paradoxically, this has at times benefited me. It is a part how I come to be pursuing a PhD. But thinking of this usually lead me to ask if I was really seen in the selection, if the institution is really trying to answer my needs, or simply reaching through me for generalized solution. This question I know resonates powerfully across marginalized community. Categories are ways of looking at, not listening to. The strategy of inclusivity are not usually designed for the marginalized, nor they usually work. Rather, at least for me, they tend to reproduce intense memory of exclusion based on my differences and obedience to established power. They perpetuate segregation, drawing an ever sharper line between myself and the others. They seem to suggest that I am incapable of choosing my community or of jumping between their different priorities. But problem of color, race, gender cannot be sliced, treated separately. They are a body. Its parts have different function, but the whole body and its organ feed each other. And even when one organ is healthy, it can become a great support to the rest. And that's why I don't want to be woman of color. I want to be called colorful woman, with so many identities layering me as a person. I choose also to perform as a weed in academia, while producing knowledge in a way that will empower me. I will tell you why a weed. Here in my garden, it was not a question of beauty to remove the weed, but my neighbor kept asking me to do it. They were seen as do not fit. For me to keep the weed was because I saw it ecological and more economic choice, as grass needed water, care, and keep adding more seeds. So I decided to leave dandelion and promote clover over the grass. I stopped watering the grass and let the nature do the job. The question I asked was, how a static idea change? Why we love seeing these weeds and enjoy benefiting from what they do only when they are when they are usually growing, but not in our backyard, not this close. As marginalized, I do have quality of weed. Every one of us and every weed is there for a reason. I learned that common dandelion that disturbed my neighbor was there mostly there to soften the soil. The plant goes away as the job is done and search for another place to work the soil beside it is edible and full of nutrition. This made me the colorful woman, the weed in academia, to allow the change and to work the soil and give it a quality for nourishing all colors. So if we think university, then we should remain open to other forms of embodied knowledge. As we learn from birds, straw by straw, a home is made. We learn architect. Learn from spiders, make it from your own body. We learn about belonging. Learn from ants, make it the future. We learn preservation. Learn from bees, make it collective. We learn about community's power. Learn from mother, make it within you. We learn that one can grow while within others. Learn from children, make it playful. We learn the power of exploration and playfulness. Learn from philosopher, create idea. We learn that value exceed objects. Learn from artist, imagine it. We learn how to see possibility and the unseen. Learn from tree, make it where roots can grow and breathe. We learn that there is always a new coming. Learn from clouds, make it everywhere they can be. We learn we are in endless change. Learn if one home die, another is born. No one can eliminate other, keeping them within otherness. And I will end with what the mystic poet Jalaluddin al-Rumi said. Truth is a mirror that falls from the hand of God and was broken. Everyone picks up a part and says the whole truth out there. And Gülden, which by the way means flowering in Kurdish, the tireless work and resistance she showed us is one part of that mirror. It is upon us to continue finding other parts, have the truth that needed to end all form of violence and oppression. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Khadija, for your beautiful words. And, thank you for being a weed in academia, and I hope to also be a weed myself. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Simten Coşar. Simten Coşar is a feminist political scientist. Between 2007 and 2021, she researched and taught courses at the University of Pittsburgh, Cornell University, and Northern Michigan University in the United States, and at Carleton University, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. She has published on political theory, feminist politics, Turkish intellectual history, and the history of political thought in Turkey. In the English-speaking and reading world, she is the co-editor of Universities in the Neoliberal Era, Academic Cultures and Critical Perspectives, which is out with Palgrave Macmillan. It came out in 2017. And she is also the co-editor of Silent Violence, Neoliberalism, Islamist Politics, and the AKP Years in Turkey in 2012. She has translated major texts in social sciences from English to Turkish and from Turkish to English. Her most recent translation is Handan Şalayan's germinal work on the Kurdish women's movement, Women in the Kurdish Movement, Mothers, Comrades, Goddess with Palgrave Macmillan 2020. She has been conducting research on feminist encounters in neoliberal academia with a view to autoethnographic extensions. Simten has been acting as the associate editor of Samsonia Way magazine. Thank you, Simten.
Thank you, Athena, and thank you all for organizing this meaningful panel and considering me as a participant. It's really hard for me to talk in such panels, so it took me some time to decide what to say, how to phrase it. Then I came up with a formula, and I hope I do not extend beyond my go over my the spare time for my talk. If I do so, please excuse me and please warn me. I can just stop and kind of take over from where I left during the discussion or the Q&A phase. So in order to not to bore you, I'm going to read because this is too emotional for me, so I might be kind of not good with the grammar and the way I form sentences. Deciding what to focus on in honoring Gülden's activist, intellectual, and academic engagements is hard. It's hard because I expect, and hope that my friend and colleague, who was in the very beginning of our relation, would be the one to talk about me after I pass away. It's hard because starting from her second year in undergraduate studies as her professor, I have read almost all texts by Gülden, first as her professor, then as her colleague, then as her friend and comrade and co-author. And finally, it's hard because you do not want to do injustice to a colleague and comrade when trying to talk about her amazingly rich involvement in all layers of knowledge production, activist, intellectual, and academic. Here is the method that I came up with. I will be quoting, rarely paraphrasing from Gülden's works, of course the selected ones, which speak to her activist, academic, and intellectual engagements. In the very beginning, I would like to quote directly from her chapter on policing in contemporary Lethbridge, one of her latest works. She says, "No doubt that policing means control over oppressed bodies," which for me summarizes the way she approached academia, her intellectual interests, and also her activist concerns. Let me start with her PhD thesis, which is more than its title says, Orchestrating the Public, a Contribution to the Critical Modern Police Power. Here I quote from her response to the need to add a methodology section, which I loved, to every thesis, and thenceforth to many scholarly articles. Quote, "My resistance to consistent methodology is not as strong as that of Barry Hindless, for example, who claims there can be no rational or coherent prescriptive methodology. Yet I support his stance in claiming that methodologies are based on the unjustified presumption of a rationalist, coherent, consistent conception of social action. With this thesis, I aim to propose a way to study the role of police and public spheres in capitalist societies. Rather than a method, I aim to highlight certain aspects of social relations relating to the projects of police and the public to understand how the kind of politics specific to modern societies operates. The current work in this sense is organized around finding a better research strategy to understand the relationship between the formation of the publics and the police function. Therefore, rather than using a methodology, my study aims to offer a research strategy. First, despite my claim above, I do not deny that class structure and uneven power structures exist in our societies. Rather, I suspect that every social relation can be explained with reference to social structuration. I will not go on with the second and the third options, but I will select the subject matter of her thesis. She says, quote, "Although the subject matter of my thesis involves the history of ideas and social history, I have no intention to act as a historian. My aim is rather to understand today's politics through demystifying its major components. In other words, the public sphere and the police function. In this, I agree that historical processes move in such a manner that long-run trends interact with faster moving and more deliberate processes. through revealing these historical continuities and discontinuities in the modern projects of police and the public. I try to develop an understanding of the present struggles. That is, my attempt corresponds to Perry Anderson's observation that theory is now history, with a seriousness and severity it never was in the past, as history is equal to theory in all its exigency in a way that it typically evaded before, unquote. Thus, she pursues her creative and critical work on police and public sphere in England, despite all the odds. The odds are clarified in a different and seemingly unrelated work that we co-authored. I believe the last work that will be published in the coming months. Feminist Praxis in Exile, a collaborative autoethnography. I will come to it later. Her second work that I picked up for this panel is published in a bilingual journal, English and Turkish, in 2014, Revisiting National Security Discourse in Turkey with a View to Pacification, from Military Power to Police Power on to Orchestration Power. There she talks about the public spheres of the nation states, how they are shaped with bourgeois priorities, and what this shaping tells us about the connection between public spheres and national security, which she refers as pacification. Quote, thinking through militarism with a sole focus on military prevents us from seeing other facets of militarism. Pacification provides us with a broader framework to define and understand how militarism functions in our lives, hidden underneath the daily activities just below our concern for security. More security brings more militarization, just as it brings less security. Thus, it's apt to argue that the reflection of the spirit of the 21st century on Turkey's politics can better be understood not in terms of the whether traditionalized civil-military dichotomy, but in terms of the relation between neoliberalism and pacification. In other words, an analysis on the persistence of authoritarian practices, sometimes recalling a tendency to totalitarianism, should transcend military versus civilian regimes formula and be grounded on the conceptualization of national security as a police technique that is embedded into neoliberalism, so as to function as a means for pacification, unquote. The third work that I picked is on academic knowledge production processes in neoliberal authoritarian contexts and how securitarian discourses run through these processes. The title is Neoliberalism, National Security and Academic Knowledge Production in Turkey, again a chapter for an edited volume, edited by the late Aziz Chaudhry. Gülden here takes issue with authoritarian state practices in talking about social and political truths and the exemplary moments where these practices have been resisted. She talks about peace academics. She's one of them. I'm one of them. In Turkey, more than 2,000 academics who were subjected to state violence of different sorts due to their signing of a peace statement in January 2016. Her argument is that this is not unprecedented in Turkey, so there are continuities and discontinuities in terms of state repression over critical knowledge production, and that one can elaborate on this through the discursive practices of national security. In doing so, she starts with the historical ties in different generations of leftist movements and or youth movements that opt for democratic regimes. She distinguishes the case of peace academics from the previous corps of critical voices in the universities with a view to the nature and dynamics of international solidarity networks, among others, in her own words. The support that the dismissed peace academics received from international solidarity networks is not comparable to that received in previous cases. Since the very beginning, the Scholars at Risk Network and Scholars Rescue Fund have been very active in building international solidarity with dismissed or at-risk academics. And she mentions also the German Federal Office supporting the Philipp Schwarz initiative of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, also the PAUSE program in France. Continues. With the impact of these organizations, the issue of dismissed academics has been framed around the topics of academic freedoms and human rights. Framing it in this way has its limits as the issue has been reduced to a legal question, since the neoliberal authoritarian nexus and pacification aims of the nation's security discourse are hidden. she has this wit actually. She has this wit of kind of seeing the really difficult to see details in certain claims to rights, in certain rights-based claims. She continues, many intellectuals today argue that these are the darkest times for academic rights and freedoms in Turkey. This chapter contests such a perspective, which tends to do injustice to those who suffered immensely in previous years. This view also yearns for the good old days, ignoring the long history of discrimination against women, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and Kurdish people in Turkish academia. Although it's true that anti-intellectualism is an identifying feature of neoliberal policy agendas, it's important to note that the anti-intellectualism of neoliberalism is built on state-led repression, which aims to maintain the social order. Therefore, learning from past experience could not be possible by simply comparing today's suffering to that of the past. And she continues with similar cases of repression in the case of the Ismail Beşikçi, who is for a long time the only non-Kurdish academic studying Kurds in Turkey, Pınar Salek, who has been persecuted and forced to exile due to her work on the Kurdistan Workers' Party, her sociological work on Kurdistan Workers' Party. The fourth work that I picked up is one we co-authored, A Feminist Analysis of Security in Turkey, Neoliberal Patriarchy, Authoritarianism and Package Politics. This was published in the Journal of World Systems Research in 2021. Here we underline that in neoliberal context, citizens are called into a bifurcated state of existence. On the one hand, privacy and domesticity permits the social identity of the citizens, bringing in familial priorities, mostly defined in religious terms in the Turkish context. On the other hand, social rights of the citizens are absorbed by the rights of the entrepreneurial individual. The contradiction between these two states of being is managed by moral economies. So we continue with the detailing of the AKP's, Adjustment Development Party's role. The site of moral economies in this role links both to the family and the public order. Family is claimed to be a site for reproduction and social imagination. Public order, on the other hand, is envisaged as a religio-communitarian side of police regulation. There we analyze the family package and the internal security package as two corresponding securitization of Turkey's politics and social relations. I'm trying to cut the quotations that I pasted here. Here, what distinguishes this article from the other works is that we use critical feminist epistemology in trying to understand the crosscuts between social security discourse and practice, and also national security discourse and practice, which actually drew a lot of harsh criticisms and sometimes vulgar criticisms from mainly the maleist referees. At certain points, we were questioned with the connection that we formed between the increase in national security expenses and the increase on the authoritarian rule of the state in Kurdish provinces of Turkey, despite the concrete evidence that we provided. This was one really important observation that we had in trying to understand what kind of an audience we have among the academic circles in Turkey, especially starting with the last decade. The fifth one is Gülden's chapter on policing in Lethbridge, again a new one. She says that today the police seem inevitable in modern societies. When we ask questions, why do we need the police, or what do police do, we often hear people talk about the police's fight, police's engagement in the fight against crime, or police's role to provide security. However, historically speaking, the role of the police is much more complex and to a great extent different than fighting crime. In contrast to popular belief, research shows that majority of police work is not fighting the crime. Rather, a huge chunk of police work is patrol work. Whether on foot or in car, on horse or bicycles, police officers patrol the various urban places. Thus, again, the connection between the police spaces and the urban spaces. Then she asked, how should we understand or rather justify the police presence on our streets? She continues with the repression that was mainly directed against First Nations in Canada. How the war against drugs is connected directly with the repression on the First Nations. How the concept of racial profiling helped the state to have, help the police or facilitated the police power in the public spheres and also in the shaping and the boundaries of the public sphere. And the last work that I selected, we have a lot of things going on here, but I'm just skipping in order to keep up with the time. And the last work that I selected was again a co-authored one that I proudly own to have written with Gülden. As I said in the beginning, it's feminist practice, feminist exile as praxis, collaborative auto-ethnography. In our collaborative account, I'm quoting it right now, we try to interrogate, reflect on, and theorize about the unfolding of neoliberal knowledge production patterns across 20 years. We frame the narration along, first, spaces of knowledge production, means of knowledge production, and third, distribution, dissemination of knowledge, and fourth, contestations in everyday academic life. We believe that building our accounts and conversation on these themes helps us problematize the class, gender, race intersection in experiencing both as teachers and students, exploitative mechanisms in neoliberal higher education systems. We further try to observe how we have navigated the neoliberal academia without compromising collaboration, even in dire times of personal and institutional crises. Here we emphasize collaborative feminist production as interventions to male-oriented, profit-driven, everyday practices in the neoliberal academia. The main argument of the paper is that feminism as practice has always been an exile metaphorically and literally in academia, and collaborative feminist knowledge production reveals the promises of production in exile as a form of strategy for struggling against neoliberal exploitation across class, gender, race. I'm not sure whether I'm beyond the time spared for me. Do I have time, Suzanne, or? I'm beyond? Yeah, okay, so I should just wrap it up. So I'm just coming to the last paragraph. Sorry for this again, for the, sorry again. For Gülden, this is to paraphrase, I say that Gülden has persisted in theoretical work, which she considered to be a means for recognition in white male dominant academic life. The way we understood feminism helped us to avoid disconnecting our bodies from our intellect. Thus, I shall repeat the quotation that helped me in starting this talk. No doubt that policing means control over oppressed bodies. Hope to talk a lot and more in the Q&A section.
Thank you so much, Simten, for showcasing Gülden's breadth and brilliance as an intellectual. Thank you. Our next speaker is Nisha Nath. And I also wanted to note that there's a comment, sorry, in the Q&A asking us to increase the volume. I'm not sure how to do that, but if there's someone in the back end who can work on that, I just wanted to mention that there. Okay, so Nisha Nath is a settler woman of color in Amiskwacîwâskahikan, Edmonton, and an assistant professor of equity studies at Athabasca University. In December 2020, alongside Dr. Gülden Özcan, Dr. Tarek Yunus, Dr. Evan Light, she began collaborating on a British Academy-funded project on racial capitalism and security. She is also working on a manuscript on The Letters with Doctors Davina Bandar, Rita Damoun, and Anita Gervin, and continues to work with Dr. Willow Samara Allen on a SSHRC-funded project on the settler colonial socialization of public sector workers. Thank you so much, Nisha.
Thank you, Athena. There we go. So I have been thinking of and learning from Gülden how these multiple traffics and travels of one's own and one's lineages of migration that brought my family to this extractive white supremacy of this prairie town in the late 1960s invoke a particular kind of, or a particular set of relational accountabilities for variably positioned women of color on paths that are filled with, in her words, rocks and thorns. So how she enters into her work is really informing how I'm also coming into her work as well. So like all of us, my personal, intellectual, and collaborative relationship with Gülden was cruelly truncated. And perhaps unlike many of you, my intersection with Gülden was more recent, but it was an intertwining that felt quite serendipitous. I knew Gülden first through her generosity in being an astute, thoughtful, and careful respondent to a talk I gave that was sponsored by Snack Plus in collaboration with the Women Scholars Speaker Series. And it was a talk that implicated the kind of anti-racist and anti-oppression work we both were engaged in at our institutions, as well as our shared ethos of refusal to the terms that are laid out by the EDI Academy. And then 1 month later, I saw her name appear in my email box, and she was listed as one of the participants in a Knowledge Frontiers symposium on security. And so while our first meeting was in a context where we were speaking about how we are called into crisis work at our institutions, we shared in common that we were scholars engaged in critical readings of state deployments of insecurity. So I was extraordinarily nervous about that symposium, and immediately upon seeing Gülden's name, I reached out to her as an anchor. And we traveled our participation in that symposium together, transparently sharing our collective confusion over the process. We were quite at ease in our shared posture of humility, but we were also bonded in our aversion to an analysis of frameworks reifying vulnerability. And so as Athena mentioned, we began to collaborate most intensely alongside Tarek Yunus and Evan Light on this project, exploring the intersections of security and racial capitalism. And then again with Tarek, we also dreamed up this project mapping the fundamental insecurity and precarity faced by certain scholars who study security. And so these collaborations are ongoing, but they have almost frozen in time without Gülden. But I will say that the warmth of sitting with Gülden's work over the past little while is adding breath and life to them again. So in preparing to make my brief comments today, I was thinking of how our two worlds collided, our two institutional worlds, our personal worlds, and the worlds demanding our epistemic labor on equity and anti-racism, presumably on one side, and then on security and insecurity, presumably on the other side. And it was clear very, very early on that these worlds are in fact contiguous and co-implicated. So to prepare, I embarked on this project of gathering up and rereading the exchanges I had with Gülden, of listening to recordings I have of Gülden, of re-witnessing those exchanges by taking new notes, by rewriting my ongoing work, and then by presencing her in my work in new ways. And so I've spoken in other contexts about gathering an epistolarium, and this felt a bit like that. And I found myself in this paradoxical space of witnessing the loss of Gülden, through a kind of emptiness or an empty space with questions that I didn't get to ask her or engage with her on, or even press her on, but also the gathering up, enacting a filling up of space, because she is present now as part of our collective lineage of thought through the interventions that she has gifted us and the provocations she raises that we can be accountable to take up, particularly as we reflect on the university and its worlds. So I want to share a couple of her provocations to carry forward beyond today. So this is the first thing I wanted to share today, because in re-witnessing Gülden's work, I see the themes of loss, accountability, and paradox. I think that in the academe, and especially in the EDI academe, where these 3 letters are deployed institutionally to repackage white supremacy, colonialism, militarism, heteropatriarchy, imperialism, and occupation. In this academy, we experience a lot of loss, and much of it is structural and systemic. So we experience the loss of students who are systemically sifted out, the loss of precarious faculty who cannot continue, the loss of those who enact intentional refusals of the terms of the academe, the loss of academics who are politically dislocated through state-sponsored violence and surveillance in the name of security, and then, of course, the loss of luminaries like Gülden, a thinker who drew all of these epistemic links, including the link between her own labor and this bridge called My Back, and what these extractive institutions and the racism and misogyny baked into them do to our bodies and our health. I don't think we sit with that loss enough within the academe, or more specifically, that loss itself is an analytic that we can tether to other analytics, like that of pacification, as Gülden does in her work. So in not sitting with loss as analytic, we surrender so much, losing not just those relationships, but the presence of that epistemic labor, those embodied experiences, and that embodied knowledge. So in fact, in sitting with loss as analytic, we build in its refusal because it invokes presence. Gülden's work does sit with loss through the lens of pacification, securitization, dissidence, and resistance, because in her work, Gülden notes how the mobilization, regulation, and creation of publics through securitization processes represents a kind of foreclosure that cannot and must not be surrendered to. So I see in Gülden's work an invocation and invitation to sit with loss as analytic in order to spark urgency. There is a risk in reading Gülden's work that one might focus solely on the tactics of securitization and pacification, but this to me erases the heart of her work, which is animated by a refusal to surrender these losses. And this is something we see so clearly in her work with Scholars at Risk and her writing on pacification in Turkey. So I am paradoxically sad and happy today because this marking of her work is a refusal to surrender that loss and her epistemic labor. And this is in keeping with her research, her ethical posture, and her commitments. And this defies so much of what the neoliberal EDI academe works to disappear. Second, and related, is a defiance and a deep skepticism of the neoliberal logics that structure the neoliberal EDI academy that is clear to me in Gülden's work. Gülden drew intrinsic connections between the broad themes animating her scholarship, so securitization, policing, dissidence and resistance, insecurity, neoliberalism, pacification, publics, to how she conceptualized entering into service work, the theories of change animating that work, her conceptualization of what the university was and is, what institutionalized EDI practices are paradoxically doing. So put differently, through her work, she implores us to make connections between the state, capital, and the deployment of state power. And while much of her scholarship focused on Turkey, I read her work as an invitation that we must be contextually vigilant and skeptical of the rewriting of the academy that we are witnessing in multiple contexts. She writes of market-oriented research, market-friendly curriculums, how universities are funded, the redefinition of universities' primary objectives, the dissolution of forms of social solidarity, the increase in private universities, the increasing precaritization of academic labor, and unpaid overtime. So I want to pull from a piece of her writing with Simten, where they describe security as follows, quote, "Security is an active and unfinished project. A social project refers to rationalized, somewhat consistent, carefully planned tasks with certain targets, agents, means, technologies, and strategies. Thus, the security projects are always incomplete, producing unintended consequences due to the resistance of the governed, which leads to their alteration, abandonment, or significant transformation in their structures depending on their response. In times of crisis, the security projects appeal to the general public through the manufacturing of common sense based on safety concerns," end quote. Gülden reminded us that the real meaning of security is to orchestrate a social order that complies with the accommodation of capital, private property, and exploitation of labor. And I'm drawing from her words there. Moreover, under neoliberalism, the discourse of security has been hegemonic in constructing security itself as part of the self-care individuals are responsible for. This becomes instituted as common sense, and we, the citizen subjects, become, quote, "carriers of the discourse, agents of surveillance, and warriors of insecurity," end quote. Security does something to us. It turns us, changes us, produces us. For example, she writes this on police power, quote, "Police power turns all kinds of potential dissenting populations, often proactively, into the public. That is, an addressable, responsible, accountable, and transparent subject. This in turn makes dissent predictable, reversible, and non-anonymous," end quote. So I pull us to Gülden's expansive writing about the work of security because she is whispering in our ears, especially during this moment where the academe continues to be under attack, where those of us who teach from insurgent and resurgent lineages of knowledge remain targets. How is neoliberal authoritarianism operating in knowledge production processes in neoliberal contexts? This is her question. What and who is the university securing? What and who is institutionalized EDI securing? What does the pacification of the university look like here? What are the technologies or tactics of pacification? So in that moment where Gülden and I transitioned from meeting at an EDI talk and then finding each other at a symposium on security, she made those connections clear in her emerging scholarship with the Anti-Security Research Collective. And so here she described how security is mobilized and penetrates all aspects of our lives: policymaking, commodities, rights-based claims, national security, job security, workplace security, supply chain security, environmental security, food security. And so for her, anti-security approach brings a radical rejection of security discourses because those discourses trade on, quote, colonizing and de-radicalizing, end quote. So as Gülden explained, security recodes how we understand hunger, exploitation, imperialism, environmental degradation. And so here, Gülden raised a provocation that I hope we not only take up, but that we contextualize in her specific contribution, that we start to reconceptualize anti-security work as anti-racist work. And those are her words. And this was a specific lacuna she identified in the growing literature on anti-security studies. So I think Gülden would ask us to look at the university and at EDI through the lens of not just securitization, but of pacification. What happens when we intentionally start to push back on security within the context of the academe. How might that shift our anti-racist practices, but also dislodge what the institution is trying to secure? So my good friend, Dr. Ethel Tungohan writes, when writing, I've begun to see my citations as love letters to fellow thinkers who came before me and who write alongside me, end quote. Gülden graced me with her generosity in offering her reflections about a project I have on the letters. And I offer these reflections as a sort of letter back. The thing that we know about letters is that they are relational and that they can close the gap between time and space, which is something that I imagine many of us are longing for today. So I want to close by offering thanks to Gülden for her epistemic labor, which I see as a love letter to all of us. But also thanks to those who invited me here today, Dr. Suzanne Lennon, Dr. Christine Alexander, to the Women's Studies Scholar or Women's Scholar Speaker Series, but then also to my dear friend, Dr. Caroline Hodes, close friend of Gülden's, who introduced us in the first place. So my thanks to you all.
Thank you so much, Nisha, for this beautiful love letter to Gülden. Our final speaker is Arturo Tejeda Torres. Arturo Tejeda Torres is a PhD candidate in cultural, social, and political thought, situated in the Sociology Department at the University of Lethbridge. He graduated with a BA in social psychology from the Autonomous University of Querétaro in 2014, and an MA in philosophy from the University of Guanajuato in 2017. Currently, his PhD research provides an analysis of discourse and ideology as it unfolds within the context of Facebook commentaries and the Mexican daily presidential conferences by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, surrounding the recent feminist protests against the increasing number of femicides in Mexico. Thank you so much, Arturo.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for that presentation, and thanks everyone. I just give me 1 second here. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to. So I thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. Thanks, Suzanne, Christine, Athena, and everyone who made it possible, and also thanks to the other panelists. When I heard about this panel, I was and I'm still very excited or happy to have the opportunity engaging with Gülden's ideas and with her work. I think this was a very important space that needed to happen. Earlier this year, February, we had the award ceremony for her, and it was a beautiful ceremony where we had the opportunity to share some of the stories, our experiences with her, talk to her, and it was something that I really appreciated and cherished that opportunity. But I think it's also another moment that we needed, and that's why I feel so happy or excited about this space, this panel. It's hard to say happy. I'm saying this and thinking of this in terms of how having the opportunity of engaging with Gülden's ideas. And so I feel this was such an important thing to happen, because now we can also continue having these conversations, not only about our experiences, but also about all of her work and her actions and how that relates and connects with our current reality. So I tried to do that. I spent the last few days, the last few weeks reading some of her work as other panelists did. And I tried just to focus on some specific elements and connect these with well, to draw some ideas to think about the theme of this year's Women's Scholar Speaker Series. And so for this, I'm going to focus on two specific articles, which have already been mentioned by Simten and sorry, I'm having some troubles here finding myself. Okay, perfect. So these articles have been already mentioned here in the panel, but well, I will try to touch on some elements. I'm going to say some things that have already been mentioned and have already been mentioned better. But well, I'm just going to try to continue in that line. So the first article I'm going to touch on is one titled Revisiting National Security Discourse in Turkey with a View to Pacification, from Military Power to Police Power under Orchestration of Labor Power. And the second article is a chapter titled Neoliberalism, National Security, and Academic Knowledge Production in Turkey. The first one was published in 2014. She was still a PhD student, actually, which is really nice to connect on that level as well. The second article was published in 2020, and it appeared in the book, The University and Social Justice, Struggles Across the Globe. Now, the discussions addressed here in both articles are situated in the political and social history of Turkey, mainly focusing on the events occurred through the military coup of 1980, the later rise of the Justice and Development Party, AKP, in 2002, and the failed attempt of another coup in 2016. Based on the first article, I will address the relation between pacification and security and its role in the construction of a neoliberal order and an imposed common sense. And based on the second article, I will talk about the way such processes are reflected in the organization of universities. These to raise questions related to resistance and transformation. Now, before I start talking about these articles, I just want to share with you that one of our frequent topics of conversation was the similarity between our two countries, Mexico and Turkey. I must admit that I didn't fully understand sometimes some of these relations until later after reading her work. But what it became clear to me back then and even more today was that Gülden's work emerged from a necessity to understand, share, and question the political experiences that marked her close reality. In other words, what we can find in her papers is a political thinking. But this is not only because of the theories and concepts used, but also because of its closeness to the collective experiences of struggle and resistance and their role in the process of transforming a society. Following this logic, we are here today carrying her words and ideas to think about one of our close realities, the universities. So in the first article I mentioned before, Gülden approaches to the notion of security and its process of securitization as a term that reflects both monopoly of violence and consent creating aspects of the state and the ruling class. The same class that has used it against opposition and as a way to secure a foundation for capital accumulation, cheap wage labor, and an easy flow of goods and services in the free market. As Gülden notices, securitization since 9/11 has turned into an ideology that allows to justify and incentivize policymaking processes and rights-based claims on every single aspect of our lives, which we can see through the terms of national security, social security, food security. We could talk about education security these days, and so on and so on, as it was mentioned before. It is also important to notice that this has become a central piece in the structuration of a neoliberal order that has placed the responsibility of security on the people and institutions as part of a self-care mandate. It is under this context that it becomes necessary for Gülden to address such a notion notion of security from a counter-hegemonic perspective that allows us to see its functioning beyond the system we are embedded in. This perspective is the one of pacification. Gülden tracks down the notion of pacification to the 16th century, where it appeared in relation to the idea of conquest, and as a new war strategy that intended to establish cooperation with lords and nobles, gathering information about the communities that were being conquered, seeking friendship, showing love, and keeping their children as hostages under the pretext of teaching them. In other words, the concern of pacification was no longer about the territorial gain, but about the population, gaining their hearts and minds. Development of a police science around the same time is significant, as the police itself appeared to become a central mechanism for the process of pacification by reifying a particular social order in societies. As Gülden mentions, in regard to the relation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the police helped foster the hegemony of the new mode of governance along with the capitalist ideals, while at the same time informing, training, civilizing, and orchestrating people. That is, every process of pacification already implies a process of securitization. The relation between both notions consists in a dual function, as she says, building a civilized society and political order while destroying all values and those allegedly opposed to the new order. This way to pacify becomes a synonym of domestic and international colonization by creating productive and docile subjects that secure the conditions for capital accumulation and the circulation of goods while reproducing the bourgeoisie order and eliminating their insecurities. Finally, we can see the success of pacification tactics when they become part of our everyday practices and make of an ideology a common sense. Without referring or naming the specific ideology and politicizing daily activities within the seemingly depoliticized and apolitical spheres of action. Now, in the second article, the chapter she wrote in this book, the name of the second article, Neoliberalism, National Security and Academic Knowledge Production in Turkey, Gülden presents clear examples of such tactics of pacification and securitization through the changes that the university as an institution went through or has gone through in Turkey as a response to new political structures that included an alignment to the neoliberal order. In 1981, after the military coup, the Council of Higher Education, also known as CISSC, was established as a way of centralizing the university system. Its control was justified on the grounds that a new system able to coordinate higher education institutions and regulate the degree of politicization in the system of instruction was needed. According to Gülden, the council has served to infuse a business mentality into universities via the practices of standardization and the discourse of high efficiency, coupled with disciplinary regulations, including bans on political activism on campuses. Under the same logic, universities' primary objectives were redefined at the same time that curriculums were changed in order to benefit a market-oriented perspective. Similar scenario was presented now under the AKP party a few years later with the incorporation of the Bologna process as a side that, as Gülden notices, matched the JOC's authoritarianism with the neoliberal requisites. The process aims for a standardization based on European higher education policies. And some of the outcomes of these changes consisted in the opening of a large amount of private universities, as well as a further precarization of academic labor and unpaid overtime of those in relatively secure academic positions. One more example of the pacification security tactics can be found after the attempted coup in 2016, where a major purge in the universities was conducted under the claim of national security. Groups such as Academics for Peace, who presented a peace statement calling on the Turkish government to end violence in Kurdish provinces, were some of the most striking groups to be dismissed. Transformation of the universities within the 2-year state of emergency announced after the attempted coup made more visible the AKP government's repressive policies, while ensuring the docility of the remaining academics. Now, an important and interesting aspect about both Gülden's articles is the discussion presented in the final section before the conclusions. And I have to say, well, these articles were written in different times, and they still share the same structure, which is something that I really appreciated. And I really like both articles and discussing cases of resistance of such processes of pacification and securitization. In the first article, we can see the description of the strike driven by the workers of the alcohol and tobacco monopoly of Turkey in 2010. The event represents for Gülden a stand-up against the imposition of a hegemonic common sense built on neoliberal values. The second article, we are presented with cases of resistance in the context of universities, such as the Petition of Intellectuals in 1984, Bread and Rights Petition in 1986, the King Villar Incorporation, or in the post-1980 period, the group Solidarity Academies or the Scholars at Risk. Following the same structure as Gülden, I would like to finish with a brief comment about a case of resistance. In terms of understanding the idea of resisting, I find in the Foucauldian approach an appealing definition from which an argument, I think, can be drawn. And of course, this is my understanding of the Foucauldian approach to resistance. Resistance is already part of every relation of power. It is embedded in all of the discursive dynamics we dwell daily. That shouldn't be read, however, as a passive position regarding our scope of action, as if just because it's already there, there's nothing we need to do. On the contrary, I believe it compels us to adopt an active position by acknowledging and embracing the diverse and daily acts that go against an imposed common sense, while revealing that there are alternative logics that are still present among us. While saying this, I'm thinking of a post on Facebook that Gülden did on February 10th of this year. UFL faculty is officially on strike, can be read at the beginning of the post. And she later finishes the post saying, I am so glad that I have a union that negotiated all the extended health benefits so that I could afford expensive cancer treatments and side effect treatments, and while doing so, enjoy the privileges of having been on medical leave. ULED is worth fighting for. Working conditions are learning conditions. Universities work because we do. Equity, parity, respect. I see in her post an act of resistance against an ongoing order, a neoliberal order, that imposes itself by pushing us to forget that every new policy, cuts of fundings, restructuration, modification of contents, elimination of contents, addition of contents, and so on, are not only about labor conditions, academic conditions, or even knowledge conditions, but also about life conditions, life and death conditions. I see in Gülden's post a reminder of this, of an alternative common sense with an alternative logic that claims for solidarity and support. I see the same resistance in both of the papers I have talked about. And I keep seeing the same resistance in this panel made in her honor. From the recognition of these acts, our questions can emerge, questions regarding the processes of pacification and securitization, not only as ways of encountering the practices and meanings that have snaked into our daily life and institutions, but also as openings for other practices and meanings that either are already around us or are waiting to be built. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arturo, for that very rich and nuanced discussion of Gülden's work, and then for bringing it into our working spaces within the Academy and the University of Lethbridge. Thank you, everyone, for your moving discussions of Gülden. I'm now going to pass things over to my colleagues, Suzanne and Christine, for the Q&A.
Oh, thank you so much, all of you, for these love letters to Gülden. I feel really moved and have a lot to think about. I don't know if, Christine, if you want to say anything, and also just to invite if people want to say any words or comments or questions, to put them in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'm just really speechless. These are beautiful, really moving reflections. And I think in particular, something that Nisha mentioned, thinking about loss as an analytic. And I would say, yeah, that on so many levels, that's, yeah, thank you for that. And I see some movement in the Q&A. There were 2 comments that maybe I might begin by reading those and then encourage folks. I would say I'll read those 2, and then I'm also interested in hearing from you folks who spoke so gorgeously on the round table, if you would like to respond to each other, perhaps. So before that, 2 comments. So the first is from Shahina. And Shahina writes, a heart-touching panel. Thank you for honoring Dr. Gülden Özcan. I became so emotional as I had the privilege to learn from her and as I can relate to some of her embodied experiences as a racialized woman. The speaker series stimulated me to become more committed to social justice. She said also that she loves Khadija Baker's idea of colorful women, not women of color. Shelley Wismath says, thanks so much to everyone who spoke for honoring Gülden. So moving and such a loss of an incredible person and colleague. So glad to see her amazing work continued by you all. Someone else has just asked that if there's a place where one can find a list of all of Gülden's publications, and I see that one of our panelists is typing an answer. So thank you for that, Simten. And I'm wondering, would you, before seeing if there were questions from other folks, would the 4 of you like to respond to anything that that your colleagues said?
I'll just pose a question if that's okay. Which is one that was informed by my own experience of kind of re-witnessing Gülden's work. And I'm just curious for you all and kind of traveling through her work again, because we all were familiar with it, but, you know, in various gradations of intimacy. But I'm curious if in revisiting her work, there were new openings that you found this time. For me, it was around the loss and paradox that stood out to me that hadn't before, but I think it was because of the experience of her not being here. So I'm just curious if you found new openings in her work and in returning to it.
Is it me to talk? Okay. I mean, just answering just one bit of it would be doing injustice, but let me note just the most forthcoming one, the one that comes to my mind immediately. Again, I can quote from our co-authored work, which would be forthcoming in an edited volume on feminist conversations. The dispensability of feminist knowledge is also related to mainstream academic language. Language as a means of knowledge production is a concern when we do not speak in the neoliberal white male vocabulary. The strict separation of the abstract talk from everyday language, the treatment of everyday experiences as mere data for higher conceptualizations and their exclusion from theoretical argumentation lock feminists into ghettos. We're called to behave ourselves when we raise the significance of racialized and gendered bodies for theorization. Gülden's experiences in critical security studies circles are telling of the racial neglect in critical research on the rise and development of national security and securitization of human existence. Insistence on the necessity to read security with an anti-racist lens is subject to silence and or dismissal by the gatekeepers on the grounds that it cannot be abstract. Likewise, our co-authored feminist intervention in reading the connection between national and social security policies in Turkey met a rigorous masculinist denial of the relation between state violence against Kurds and the deepening economic crisis. This I noted beforehand. So this is my actually, I don't remember which sentence belonged to whom here. It's a co-authored one. At certain moments it was Gülden, and at certain moments it was me for sure. But this paragraph belongs to both of us. And as we were writing this, and this happened beforehand too, I could just trace, and in other paragraphs, so I could just trace the different class backgrounds that we came up with. Me from a middle class family, she from a working class family, and how we face with the vulnerabilities in different terms, but also how we found our common grounds by being feminist academics, women academics and feminist academics in Turkey and in North America. Her insistence on bringing an everyday life into her theoretical knowledge production started well back in her second grade during undergraduate studies, which at that time pushed me to warn her that the academia is a male place and she should better to curb that a bit in order to find a place in those male circles. I'm happy that she didn't listen to me, as usual. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. There are a few more comments that I think I will read out, and then I'm also interested in, if Athena or Suzanne have any reflections that they might like to share, as well as, of course, encouraging those of you who are here with us virtually to type any comments or questions in the Q&A. So Laurie Atkin says, thank you so much for this event and the tributes. What a wonderful scholar and human. I wish she could hear this. Yeah, so do I. Leila Bektas says, this means a lot. Thank you very much. Kanim Gülden. Ibrahim Touré says, thank you for organizing this panel, and to you wonderful panelists for sharing Gülden's memories through her work. She was a kind and caring soul. Özgür Sinar. Hi, Özgür. He says she's a great story writer and theater producer, the most interesting one. While she was producing theater at the same time, she was also working as a waitress and doing a PhD. Yeah, amazing. Carol Williams is suggesting maybe having a part, maybe making Gülden's publications visible, kind of all in one place on on the U of L library website. I love that idea, and yeah, we'll follow up on that. So thanks everybody. Any other reflections?
I think there was a couple of more. So Heather Ladd also said, thank you for creating this space to honor Gülden and her work and making this event public. Thank you for sharing your words, everyone. She was a truly extraordinary person, and I think about her often, indeed. This has been such a poignant event, and I hope we can all keep her memory alive. I'm wondering if there are any plans to create an edited collection or journal issue dedicated to her scholarly legacy. Maybe that's something that one of the panelists can respond to, but I think that's a really great idea, Heather. Serena Visser, thank you so much for organizing this time of connection with Gülden and together. And then Ji Young Lee Ann, thank you very much for this precious time to remember her and connect us to her. I am missing her more and more after hearing all of you. I feel that she stays with us in many different forms. Absolutely. I guess I would just say one small comment, because I am aware of time and that people have other commitments during their day. Khadija, I was really struck by your turn of phrase about Gülden finding ways and side doors. I really like that metaphor for the way that Gülden sought to enact her values to build community and to change the soil. And I guess thinking, Nisha, your word about the rocks and the thorns and changing the soil of the university. I really like that phrase of side door. And Arturo, well, all of you just spoke about her tireless work, and we know this of her tireless work of resistance, and how that was made manifest through her vast intellectual contributions and collaborations that you also generously provided an overview for. So just, I feel really touched, and thank you all. Yeah. Athena, I don't know if you have any last words.
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, Khadija's talk about, you know, being a weed in the academy had me thinking of a wonderful book that I read that I'm sure you've all read, called Dandelion by Jamie Cha Yun Liu. And, you know, the talk about the beauty of dandelions and how, you know, to be a diasporic seed, to be someone who, you know, picks up and kind of plants themselves wherever they can and makes community there. And just, you know, how wonderful Gülden was at doing that. And just, yeah, that's that.
She was a beautiful, beautiful read.
So thank you everyone for being part of this panel and for attending, those of you out in the audience. Yeah, we will work on getting a library guide of all of Gülden's work available, and just will, I guess, you know, take the provocations that you left us with, Nisha, about Gülden's work forward. I would encourage all of us to rewatch this video and really think carefully and fiercely about the legacies and the provocations that Gülden has left us, and to really do something with the gift that she's left us in so many ways. So thank you, everyone. Take good care.
Thanks for this.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Wonderful to hear you.